Everblaze Chapter 22. Tirgan spent the rest of their sessions explaining his new guide safety procedures. The two primary rules were make eye contact every few minutes and don't do anything without warning. He also insisted that they communicate in code so that if Finton's mind became conscious at any point, he wouldn't know what they were doing. Their homework was to create their code words and have them memorize by their telepathy session on Thursday. It took them all of study hall to create their list, though that was mostly because their friends kept interrupting. Dex kept grumbling about telepaths. Diana kept begging to use her ability to sneak into the healing. And Keith kept interrupting with unhelpful suggestions like Snickerdoodle and Hippity Hop, and Keith is the awesome lord of everything. Only Gen C and Marella left them alone, though Sophie could tell they felt left out. But she wasn't dragging any more of her friends into all her drama. The commands they finally picked were Alden, no reason to worry. Mallow Melt, I found something good. Dame Alina, I'm in trouble. Verminion, get out as fast as you can. Everblaze, I'm going to use a brain push. Fitz hadn't understood why Sophie wanted a code word about brain pushes, but she'd used the rare method of channeling during Finton's memory break, and it happened right before everything went wrong. Part of her kept wondering if the two elements were connected. Hopefully, she wouldn't need to take such an extreme measure this time, but in case she did, she wanted Fitz to be warned and ready. She was going to protect him every way she could. Sophie had figured her friends would want to come over after school, but Biana and Dex both got a ton of homework from their ability sessions, and Tirgan gave Fitz concentration exercises to practice. Even Keith was stuck doing some sort of empath practice with his dad. And with Grady still not home, and Edelin outside giving the vermilion a bath, Sophie ended up roaming her empty house, trying to figure out where they would have put Jolie's old school things. There weren't a lot of places to check. The downstairs was mostly one big open space with no closets or cupboards or even any drawers. And half of the second floor was Grady and Edelin's room, which Sophie honestly wasn't sure if she was allowed to go into. So unless there was an attic she didn't know about, the only places left were Grady and Edelin's offices, and Sophie had a feeling Edelin's was the better bet. It was the place where stuff goes to die after all. Sander had to help her push open the door because a huge bin of unopened letters was blocking most of it. And the office inside was far worse than Sophie remembered. She'd never seen so many trunks and boxes in one place, all stacked into chaotic piles and draped with more junk, turning the room into a dusty maze. One trunk at a time, Sophie whispered, opening the one closet closest to her. A cloud of dust made her choke as she sifted through the tangle of silky lavender fabric inside. Sophie thought they were dresses, but when she pulled one out, she realized they were tablecloths edged with pearls and frilly lace. The trunk next to that held the same, and the one after that appeared to be the matching napkins. When the last trunk in the stack had diamond napkin rings, Sophie decided to move to a different spot. Hours passed with more of the same, and Sophie was fairly certain that the labyrinth was stretching around her, trapping her with the endless supply of dusty party decorations for the rest of her days. Her nose itched and her back ached, but she forced herself to keep going, working through two more chests of crystal goblets before she opened a small black trunk stuffed with books and scrolls. The foxfire seal on a notebook made her heart triple in speed. But when she looked closer, she realized they were from Jolie's early levels. Pages of boring lecture notes from Elven history and multi-special studies, many with doodles in the margins of a boy who looked like the photo she'd seen of Brant. There were stacks of sketchbooks, too, filled with gorgeous renderings of landscapes and creatures and other prodigies at school. Sophie had never realized Jolie was so talented, and she'd never realized she was a conjurer. But she found the elemental guide to conjuring in translocation with worn pages covered in hundreds of notes written in Jolie's loopy writing. It was eye opening and fascinating, but not particularly useful. and Sophie was about to move on to another chest when she noticed a crunched red scroll at the bottom, tied with gleaming gold ribbon and bearing a strange seal. Two hands with fingers intertwined, their wrists bound with golden threads. It took several tries to untie the extra tight knot in the ribbon, but when Sophie finally unrolled the scroll, she found five curled pages, all stamped at the top with the same seal. Underneath, in a fancy frilly script, it said, "By official arrangement of the matchmakers, matches for Jolie Ruin." Every scroll had every scroll had a date at the top of each one, exactly a month older than the last, and a title that implied that matches had been ranked. The first page said top tier, the one after it, second contenders, followed by third considerations, then fourth runners up, and lastly, final alternatives. And underneath each heading was a list of 100 names, 500 different matches to choose from overall. Sophie scanned the names. Surprised, the number 37 on Jolie's top tier matches was someone named Ollie Hex, who must be Stina's uncle or cousin or something. Also on that page were two different backers, Benesh Vacker at number 24 and Harleen Vacker at number 27, though neither were names Sophie recognized. In fact, none of the names seemed familiar, and it took her a minute to realize what that meant. She rechecked each scroll, making sure her photographic memory hadn't failed her, but it was exactly like she'd remembered. 500 names on the scrolls, 500 approved matches for Jolie, and Brand's team wasn't one of them. 23. "What are you doing?" Edelin asked from the doorway, making Sophie fumble and drop the scrolls. "Sorry, didn't mean to sneak up on you." "It's okay," Sophie told her, hoping she wasn't in trouble for being in Edelin's office. "I just thought this might be a good place to look for Jolie's school things." "Oh, I bet you're right. This is where I usually stuff anything I don't know what to do with." Edelin clapped her hands, making an enormous crystal chandelier light the room, and reveal about 100 more trunks that had been hidden in the shadows. "I've really let things get out of control in here, haven't I? Hazard of being a conjurer, I guess. It's too easy to snap my fingers and make anything I don't want to think about disappear." She opened a nearby trunk and pulled out a garland of dangling diamonds and sparkling amethysts and iridescent flowers that looked like they were woven from fairy wings. "Decorations for the wedding," she explained quietly. "I'd been making everything myself to ensure it would be perfect. But now," she crushed a fragile flower in her hand, showering the ground with sparkly crumbs. Sophie was still struggling to figure out how to respond when Edeline cleared her throat and asked, "So, have you found anything from Jolie?" "One trunk so far, but it's all older stuff. It did have this, though." Sophie showed her the matchmaker's rules. "How come I couldn't find Brand's name?" Edeline looked away, taking several deep breaths before she whispered, "Because Brand and Jolie were a bad match." Sophie frowned. "So, what if you don't marry someone on your list? It's a bad match?" "Of course. How did you think it worked?" "I don't know. I guess I figured you got a list that said, like, do not marry these people, and if you chose to marry them anyway, it was a bad match." "I suppose that would make it easier, but the only good matches are the ones the matchmakers arrange. That's why you can request up to 5 lists, though most of us find our match on the first. Grady was my number 3, and I was his number 7. Sophie couldn't help wondering who had been their number ones as Edeline moved to her side and took the scrolls. Edeline traced her fingers along the name, shaking her head sadly. Some of these options seemed like such a wrong fit, and Jolie went back every month for a new list, hoping each time it would somehow have Brand's name. But we all knew he wouldn't be on there. Brand never manifested a special ability. Wait, people without special abilities can't get married? No, they can, but they're only matched with other talentless. That seems really unfair. Brant and Jolie thought so too. The whole point of the matchmaking system is to ensure the strongest genetic potential for our offspring. And I know that probably seems strange given your upbringing, but you have to consider that there are a lot fewer of us than humans, and we live a very long time without physically aging. Left to our own devices, it would be far too easy to end up forming an attachment to a distant relative. Ew, Exactly. Varying the gene pool is essential. The matchmakers also ensure that different talents and skin colors and body types are all mixing. And of course, they also work hard to consider our own personal tastes and preferences. They receive centuries of training before they're appointed to their positions. You'll see how extensive the questionnaire is when you're old enough to register. And until then, it's best to try to keep an open mind. Sophie definitely didn't miss the part about her needing to register for matchmaking, but that was a prickly piece of word her mind wasn't ready to wrap around. So all she asked was, "What do you mean by an open mind?" Just try not to form too strong of an attachment to anyone until you receive your lists. She was looking at Sophie's ring as she said it. Sophie hid her hand behind her back. Edelin pretended not to notice as she crouched beside the trunk of wedding stuff and started sifting through. Jolie was in love with Brant pretty much the moment they met, she said, lifting out a huge knot of fancy garland and trying to untangle it. She was 6 and we were in a pet store in Atlantis and they both wanted the same gremlin. Brant offered to let her have it, but Jolie suggested they share, and that was all it took. Instant best friends, completely inseparable. For years, Grady and I watched them, hoping it would work out. Brand's family was also in the nobility, and we had no genetic connections. Surely they would end up matched. But then Jolie manifested as a conjurer, and Brand stayed in nobility detecting. Poor boy tried so hard to manifest. His parents even hired extra tutors, and he'd work with them for hours trying to trigger something, anything, but it never worked. And when it was time to register for the match, we all knew what would happen. Adeline crunched more flowers on the garlands. But they were still getting married, Sophie reminded her. They were, and Grady and I struggled with it at first, not because we didn't adore Brant, she added quickly, going back to sorting through the trunk. I'd just seen what my sister went through when she married Kessler. All the whispers and the stares and the friends who started avoiding them. Bad matches don't happen very often, so when they do, they draw lots of attention. And for years after, Julien was afraid to have children, worried something would turn out wrong with them. That's why Dex is your age, and the triplets are even younger. Fortunately, they're perfect and healthy, and I'm so happy to hear that Dex manifested an ability that will make everything so much easier. Something about Edelin's smile made Sophie very aware again of the ring on her finger. Ah, here it is, Edelin said quietly, lifting out a fragile headpiece, swirls of gold and silver set with amethysts and pearls and diamonds, and holding it up to the light. Grady and I gave this to Jolie the day we finally consented to the wedding. We'd watch her yell at the matchmakers enough to know there would be no changing her mind. She loved Brant so much, but we still had one condition. We asked her to take the elite levels, even though Brant couldn't be with her. That explained why Brant had written Jolie so many love letters while she'd been at the elite towers, and probably why he'd talk about feeling unworthy of her. She was so mad at us, Edelin whispered, accused us of trying to separate them so they'd fall out of love. But I told her that this was what my parents had asked of Kessler and Julien to prove to others, but mostly to themselves, that they belonged together. If they couldn't survive 2 years of separation, how could they survive a lifetime of scorn? So she took us up on the challenge. Said she'd prove to everyone that she wasn't making a mistake, and she definitely did. Edelin turned away, trying to hide the tears that had slipped down her cheeks. Sophie kneeled beside her, wrapping Edelin in a hug. Edelin held on so tight it was a little hard to breathe. Then she released her hold, clearing her throat several times before she dropped her arms and said, I'm sorry. We're not here to dredge up sad memories. She stuffed the circlet back in the trunk, slamming it shut with a sort of finality. We have more important things to find. Where do you want me to start looking? Sophie pointed to a row of trunks and they both set to work. But even with Sandor's help, they still barely made it enough a third of the room by dinner time. Adeline conjured up 2 plates of soggy purple leaves, which tasted uncannily like fried chicken, and they kept working while they ate. They were just reaching the halfway point when Grady poked his head through the doorway. Whoa, I can see the cloud of dust you guys are making all the way downstairs. You're home, Sophie said, standing to give him a hug. She froze when she got a better look at him. Thorny twigs were tangled in his hair, and his cape was caked with dried mud. But the 14 scratches on his left cheek were the most troubling, especially since one was still bleeding. What happened? Edelin asked, sending several streamers crashing to the floor, and she stood to inspect his injury. Nothing, Grady promised. That doesn't look like nothing. Edelin touched the skin around the wound, making Grady wince. I'm fine, I promise. I've just been in the dwarven capital trying to help them solve a mystery. What kind of mystery? Sophie asked, taking a step back as she realized his cape was caked with something other than mud, and whatever it was did not smell good. I don't know if mystery is the right word, Grady said, blotting his shake on his dirty sleeve. It's more like a situation. What's a situation? Sophie pressed when he didn't notice. Sorry. Sophie pressed when he didn't continue. Grady stared at the red stain on his cape. A large group of dwarves seemed to have disappeared. So that's chapter 23 of Everblaze.